Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I have to give a content warning. In this episode, violence is mentioned, and there are also some sexual themes in this episode. So, listener discretion is advised. Unconventional, controversial, erratic, eccentric. Those are all words that can be used and have been used to describe the subject of this week's episode. And they are all accurate adjectives. But above all else was his desire for more. More antics, more money, more fame. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 5th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets department, and people who are just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Salvador Dalí. Salvador Domingo Felipe Jacinto Dalí y Dominique Marqués of Dalí el Pujol was born on May 11, 1904 in Figueres, Catalonia, Spain. His mother was Felipa Dominique Reyes, and his father was Salvador Dalí Cusi. Salvador was his parents' second child. They had an older son that was also named Salvador, but his brother died 9 months before our Salvador's birth. He died of gastroenteritis on August 1st, 1903. He was just 2 months shy of being 2 years old. As a child, Salvador's parents would take him to his older brother's grave, and they would tell him that he was his brother's reincarnation. And they told this to Salvador so many times that he ended up believing it too. Salvador had one other sibling. It was a sister named Ana Maria. She was born in 1908. From an early age, Salvador was eccentric. It was behavior that his father had no patience for. His father was a notary and an attorney and an atheist, and he was strict. To say that Salvador and his father were not close would be an understatement. Salvador's mother, on the other hand, was a Roman Catholic that encouraged his larger-than-life behavior. Salvador was lucky enough to have a mother that indulged him in household servants that spoiled him. Even as a child, Salvador loved to draw. That was one of the many things that Salvador's mother encouraged, and even his father encouraged his artistic endeavors. And if they hadn't, well, who knows if I would even be talking about Salvador right now. As Salvador's childhood rolled on, it became clear that there was no way to patch up the gap between him and his father, as the competition between him and his father for his mother's affections grew more intense. Salvador held a lot of anger growing up, anger that he directed at his parents and his fellow classmates. Salvador wrote an autobiography, and I will talk more about that later on. But some of the things in the autobiography are true, and some of them are not. In his autobiography, he claims that when he was 5 years old, he pushed a boy off a suspension bridge. At the age of 6, he said that he deliberately gave a, quote, terrible kick to his 3-year-old sister's head. His cruelty would continue on into his teen and adult years. As a teen, for 5 years, he teased a girl that was in love with him. He would lead her on by kissing her and touching her. When he was 29, he trampled a girl who remarked on the beauty of his bare feet. He thought that was stupid. His friends had to pull the poor bleeding girl from his clutches. Behavior like this made him subject to acts of cruelty by more dominant students and by his father. Salvador had a phobia of grasshoppers, and classmates would throw them at him. It is possible that he may have suffered from Ekborn's syndrome. That is the delusional belief that insects are under one's skin. Salvador would spend a lot of time with his family at their summer home in Cadaqués. At that summer home, his parents built him an art studio. Salvador wasn't what you would call a good student. He preferred to daydream instead of paying attention in class. Because Salvador's father was an atheist, he didn't want to send his son to Catholic school, so Salvador started his education in public school. Due to Salvador's dislike in school, his father was unhappy with his grades. So his father transferred Salvador to a private school that only taught classes in French, a language that Salvador did not speak. He spoke Catalan and he was learning Spanish, though French would become the language that he would use as an artist. This new school, though, didn't change his opinion on school. He still hated it. When Salvador was at his summer home, he liked making paintings and drawings of his family and the coastline. He studied painting with a family friend, Raymond Pichat. He was an artist that painted mostly impressionist paintings. In 1917, Salvador's father organized an expedition of Salvador's charcoal drawings in their home. He had his first public expedition the following year at Municipal Theater. Raymond Pichat introduced Salvador to Futurism, and his uncle Anselme Dominique gave him a book on Cubism and contemporary art. On February 6, 1921, Salvador's world turned upside down. His mother died of breast cancer. She was 47 years old and Salvador was 16. He said that his mother's death was, quote, the greatest blow I had experienced in my life. I worshipped her. I could not resign myself to the loss of a being on whom I counted to make invisible the unavoidable blemishes of my soul, end quote. Salvador's father married Salvador's mother's sister shortly after his mother's death. Salvador loved and respected his aunt, but this did not help the younger Salvador and the elder Salvador's relationship. Salvador the elder was reluctant to let his son apply for admission at the San Fernando Academy of Art in Madrid, but Raymond Pichat convinced him to let Salvador apply. In 1922, Salvador was let into the academy. Salvador loved it. He loved the freedom he felt in Madrid. In Madrid, he was able to be even more eccentric. He grew his hair long and he grew sideburns. He started dressing in the style of English aesthetes of the late 19th century. While he was at this academy, he also experimented with different artistic styles like metaphysics and cubism. This made him popular with his fellow students, but in 1923, Salvador was suspended from the academy because he criticized his teachers, and he allegedly started a riot among the students over the academy's choice of professorship. He was also arrested that same year, and he was briefly imprisoned in Girona for allegedly supporting the separatist movement, even though Salvador was apolitical. Salvador ended up returning to the academy in 1926, but he was permanently expelled close to his final exams because he declared that no member of the faculty was competent enough to examine. While Salvador was at the academy, he made lifelong friends with Pepin Bello, Luis Buñuel, and Federico Garcia Lorca. He would later collaborate with both Luis and Federico. Federico was a poet. Federico was drawn to Salvador by the way that Salvador dressed, and Salvador, the poetic phenomenon of Federico. Just how close the two men were is not entirely known. This is a letter that Salvador wrote to Federico in 1928. Quote, "You are a Christian storm, and you are in need of some of my paganism. I will go get you and give you some seaside medicine. It will be winter, and we will light a fire. The poor beasts will be trembling with the cold. You will recall that you are an inventor of marvelous things, and we will live together with a portrait machine." End quote. Salvador said this about Federico in an interview in 1969, quote, "He was a homosexual, as everyone knows, and madly in love with me. He tried to screw me twice. I was extremely annoyed because I wasn't homosexual and I wasn't interested in giving in. Besides, it hurts." So, nothing came of it, but I felt awfully flattered vis-a-vis the prestige. Deep down, I felt that he was a great poet and that I owe him a tiny bit of the divine Dali's asshole. End quote. Salvador and Federico remained friends until Federico was assassinated on August 19th, 1936. The reason for his assassination has been debated, with some saying that his assassination was political, while some say he was assassinated for being gay. In 1925, before Salvador was permanently expelled from the academy, he had his first solo exhibition at the Del Mal Gallery in Barcelona, Spain, and he painted Pierrot and guitar. Now, I'm not going to tell you about every work of art that Salvador created because I think that would take too long. So I'm going to approach this like I did Leonardo da Vinci or William Shakespeare. I'm just going to tell you about his most important work, or if the work has something to do with the story that I am telling. In 1926, Salvador started taking trips to Paris. He would take several trips between the years 1926 and 1929. During his visits, he would meet with artists and intellectuals. One of those artists was Pablo Picasso, an artist whom Salvador revered. He also met with the painter and sculptor Joan Miro, poet Paul Eluard, and painter René Magritte. René was the one that introduced Salvador to Surrealism. Salvador's paintings became associated with three general themes. 1. Man's universe and sensations. 2. Sexual symbolism. And 3. Ideographic imagery. In 1928, he painted The Wounded Bird. In 1929, Salvador started his first surrealistic period. His paintings were oil paintings of dream images. He was influenced by Renaissance artists. He called his contribution to the Surrealist movement paranoid critical method, a mental exercise of accessing the subconscious to enhance artistic creativity. He used the method to create a reality from his dreams and subconscious thoughts. Salvador also worked on films in 1929 and 1930 with his friend Louis Buñuel. The first film is titled An Delusion Dog. It is a short film. It is a horror film. The 1930 film is titled Age of Gold. It is an hour long, and it is a surrealist tale of a man and a woman who are passionately in love with each other, but their attempts to consummate their love are thwarted by their families, the church, and the bourgeois society. It is a comedy. In 1929, Salvador painted The Enigma of Desire, My Mother. Also, Salvador had signed on for his first solo expedition in Paris in November of that year. Many of Salvador's friends were worried if he would be able to fill the gallery space because he was acting odd. He had all sorts of strange behavior, like uncontrollable fits of laughter. One of his friends that was worried about him was Paul Hilliard. Salvador took a liking to Paul's wife, Elena Dimitrievna Diakhnova. She went by Galia. Galia was 10 years older than Salvador, but she seemed to understand Salvador like no one else. She figured out that his behavior was due to his social awkwardness. She made his laughing fits disappear. Salvador was able to focus on his expedition. When Paul wanted to return home to Paris, Galia did not. She wanted to stay with Salvador. That was okay with Paul because Paul and Galia had an open marriage. He thought that she would have her fling and then be done with Salvador. Salvador filled that gallery in Paris, but Salvador didn't see the expedition because he took off with Galia to Barcelona and then another Spanish beach town. They then moved to Port Ligat. He purchased a fishing hut that initially had no light, heat, or running water. This fishing hut would be a place that he would spend a part of every year for the rest of his life. Salvador was quite taken with Galia, but Salvador's father and sister were not so taken with the older married mother. She had a daughter named Cecilia with her husband. His family friends were also not impressed. Galia wasn't the most likable person. She was described as cruel, fierce, and small. She had a, quote, demonic temper. She once cooked her pet rabbit. If she didn't like someone, she would spit on them. She would stub cigarettes out on someone's arm if she wanted them to shut up. Dealers in Paris gave her a nickname that means both a spiteful person and scabies. Louis Buñuel got so tired of her that he tried to throttle her. Salvador's father threw him out of the family home because of his relationship with Galia. But Salvador and Galia persevered. They faced disapproval, poverty, and Galia's health scares. She had a lung tumor removed and endured a brutal hysterectomy, all the while boosting Salvador's career. She handled the business side of things, but she also helped fuel his creativity. Their love was real, but it is believed to have been a love that was never consummated. In Salvador's own words, he said that he was terrified of female genitalia, and any attempts at lovemaking were stilted and unfulfilling for both. It is believed that he was a virgin when they met. Though he was addicted to masturbation, and in 1929 he painted The Great Masturbator. He liked to masturbate in front of a mirror, and he liked to host orgies and watch. Because of Salvador's aversion to sex, Galia would just seek sex outside of their relationship with other men, including her ex-husband Paul. And this arrangement worked for the both of them. Salvador exhibited his first Surrealist show in the United States in 1931. Gala pushed Salvador to commercialize his work. He created one of his most famous Surrealist works in 1931. It is the Perseverance of Memory. The painting is sometimes called Soft Watches. You probably have seen it. It is the painting of melting pocket watches in a landscape setting. It is said that the image conveys that time is not rigid and everything is destructible. Salvador's art was getting famous, but so was his behavior. He often wore a cape, had a walking stick, and an extremely long mustache. It is honestly the best mustache I have seen. His mustache was an ode to Marcel Proust. Marcel's 7-volume novel, Remembrance of Things Past, is a deep dive into childhood memory, indulgence, and sexual frustration. So it seems fitting that Salvador would have an ode to him. At a ball held in his honor, Salvador came wearing a glass case across his chest, which contained a brazier. Another time, he stepped off a boat wearing a suit with some of his paintings attached to it and waved a French baguette at the press. He also drove a Volkswagen Beetle covered in grass through Paris. And he gave a lecture at the 1936 London International Surrealist Exposition dressed in an antique diving suit. It ended badly when he started to suffocate in the soundproof suit, and the audience had to rescue him. It was not uncommon for artists during the 1930s to flirt with fascism, and Salvador was no exception. He had a friendly relationship with Spain's fascist dictator, Francisco Franco. He visited him often, and he even gave him many pieces of work. Salvador also didn't care to sell out. He used his talents to design the logo for the lollipop brand Chupa Chumps. He also endorsed Lanvin Chocolate, Alka-Seltzer, Brand Airways, and the Spanish brandy Veterano. Salvador was money hungry. The Surrealist poet Andre Breton nicknamed Salvador Evita Dollars. Even though he loved money, he was horrible with it. In his early part of his career, he was so terrible with money that he paid his secretaries with his paintings. This ended up working out best for his secretaries because his paintings appreciated to be worth, in some cases, over $1 million. So some of his secretaries became millionaires because Salvador couldn't pay them with money. By 1934, many Surrealist artists were fed up with Salvador's antics. Many Surrealist artists put Salvador on a mock trial for participating in the glorification of Hitlerian fascism. Salvador was expelled from the Surrealist movement as a result of this mock trial. And Pablo Picasso, the artist that Salvador had so much respect for, refused to mention Salvador's name and acknowledge his existence after this. But Salvador continued on. He painted the Enigma of Hitler in 1938. We don't know if he really supported Hitler or if he did it just to be shocking. Salvador said this about Hitler, quote, "I often dreamed of Hitler as a woman. His flesh, which I had imagined whiter than white, ravished me. There was no reason for me to stop telling one and all, to me, Hitler embodied the perfect image of the great masochist who would unleash a world war solely for the pleasure of losing and burying himself beneath the rubble of an empire. The gratuitous action par excellence that should indeed have warranted the admiration of the Surrealists." End quote. I first want to say that this podcast does not support fascism. And I also want to say that I believe that Salvador Dalí was a true fan of Hitler. And I say this for two reasons. One, because of the fact that that Spanish dictator that Salvador Dalí was so chummy with, that Spanish dictator also had concentration camps. And I also believe that if you are truly anti-fascist, then you know that there's a line. And you know that you don't cross that line. You don't pretend to be fascist just for shock value. A Maya Angelou quote comes into mind here. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. 1934 also brought another big event. On January 30th, 1934, Salvador and Gala married in a civil ceremony. Starting in 1934, Salvador and Gala spent their winters at the St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan, New York. It cost $20,000 a month. There, he would host parties filled with drugs, orgies, wild animals, and celebrities. Celebrities like Alice Cooper and Andy Warhol. In 2019, the St. Regis Hotel introduced a menu in his honor called the Dalí Tea. In 1935, Salvador painted the Angelus of Gala. In 1936, he painted Soft Construction with World Beans, Premonition of Civil War. In 1937, Salvador created fabric, clothing, and accessory designs with the fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli. This included the joint creation of a lobster dress that was worn by the American socialite and fellow Nazi sympathizer Wallace Simpson. And that dress is what it sounds like. It is a dress with a lobster on it. In 1938, he created the sculpture of Mae West Lips sofa, and he painted Apparition of Face and Fruit Dish on a Beach. Someone that fascinated Salvador was the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Salvador did extensive research into Sigmund's analytical texts on the inner workings of the human mind, dreams, sexuality, and the human subconscious. So, of course, Salvador took the chance to meet Sigmund in London in 1938. The meeting for Salvador had been a long time coming. He had fantasized about it and had had imaginary conversations with Sigmund in his mind. Salvador had tried many times to meet Sigmund in Vienna, but he was unsuccessful. A mutual friend, author Stefan Zweig, had arranged for Salvador and Sigmund to meet. They met on July 19th, 1938 at Sigmund's home in London. He was in London to escape Nazi persecution. Salvador wanted to make a good impression with his hero, so he brought his painting The Metamorphoses of Narcissus along with him, hoping to impress Sigmund. He also wanted Sigmund to see him as a fellow academic, so he also took an article that he wrote on paranoia with him. But you know what they say, don't meet your heroes. The meeting did not go to Salvador's liking. Salvador said that Sigmund treated him like a scientific specimen. Sigmund told Stefan Zweig, quote, "I have never seen a more complete example of a Spaniard. What a fanatic," end quote. Salvador also didn't like what Sigmund said about his painting. Sigmund said, quote, "In classic paintings, I look for the unconscious, but in your paintings, I look for the conscience," end quote. Salvador took the comment as a personal insult. Salvador had some sketches of Sigmund, and when he got home, he wrote this alongside of them. Quote, "Freud's cranium is a snail. His brain is in the form of a spiral, to be extracted with a needle," end quote. But Salvador had got it all wrong. Sigmund actually was impressed with him. Sigmund said this to Stefan Zweig, quote, Until then, I was inclined to look upon the Surrealist as absolute. Let us say 95%, like alcohol, cranks. That young Spaniard, however, with his candid and fantastical eyes and his undeniable technical mastery, has made me reconsider my opinion. End quote. And that was the first half of Salvador Dali's life. Thank you so much for listening to the 5th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode will be Salvador Dali Part 2, so we will find out what happened to him after he left the Surrealist movement, and it will be the conclusion of his story. So I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf, the Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast, and the Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I've turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right. Well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.